Good evening and welcome back, everybody. I see some people pointing at this arcane, esoteric symbol on the screen and trying to make heads or tails of whatever it is that is projected up there. We're going to talk about it quite a bit today. First off, let me just say that you probably noticed that the timbre of my voice is a little bit different tonight. The fates conspired to give me a bout of laryngitis. However, oddly enough, Providence decreed that this bout of laryngitis would strike me on a Thursday and would wane until the following Wednesday. So it's not really going to interfere with our program tonight too much. Thank you so much, Sandy. I'm actually all set. I've got some honey lemon tea. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Thank you for those who came from near and certainly from far. I want to thank my neighbor who's here, Darien's finest, Officer Stuart Schwengerer. Yeah, that's right. We love you, Stu. You handsome devil. What are the odds that I could have moved next door? Obviously, one gets really no choice when picking one's neighbors, and my neighbor happens to be a fluent German speaker. What are the odds, right? Yeah, so prost to that. Tonight, we're going to be looking at music from 1959 to approximately 1965. So a rather condensed period compared to the broader areas that we studied in the last 2 weeks. In our first meeting, we talked about a period of nearly 30 years, encompassing the years roughly spanning from the turn of the 20th century until the swing era, which generally in scholarship is believed to have begun around 1932 or 33. In last week's program, we covered another wide swath of chronological window, talking about music from the swing era into the bebop era, into the post-bop and cool jazz eras of the late 1950s. Tonight, we're going to cast a somewhat smaller net, but we're going to zoom in a little bit, turn up the magnification on the microscope, as it were, where we look at the music of really two composers this evening, Miles Davis and John Coltrane. Now, if you were wondering about the impact of these composers, take John Coltrane, for example, it may surprise some of you to know that in where else, the city of San Francisco, there is the Church of St. John Coltrane. This is their website. So I don't think it's overstating the issue by saying that Coltrane's impact would be dramatic and far-reaching. Now, what is it about this music that had captivated listeners back then and continues to enchant and captivate people today? If I can editorialize for a minute as a historical footnote to this program, I'll just say that I'm one of those people. When it comes to various sub-genres or idioms within jazz, under the macrocosm of jazz, I think it's fair to say that for me, as a performer, certainly as an improviser, I was always drawn to the modal jazz that we're going to be talking about this evening. So I'm going to hope to share with you through performance and through listening and of course through our always vibrant discussions a little bit about what makes this music so special and so different from that which precedes it. Remember the objectives that we articulated for ourselves at the beginning of this lecture series. We said that as listeners, of course, we want to immerse ourselves in great music and get to know standards and staples of each of these classic genres or subgenres within the jazz idiom. But as listeners, I think one of the most satisfying sensations is being able to hear something and say with some degree of certainty, or perhaps a great degree of certainty, oh yeah, that's Mozart. And you know what, it's not just Mozart, but it sounds like late 1780s Mozart. And you can hear that because there's really sort of intricate clarinet writing, and he didn't do that while he was living in Salzburg, so this has to be a later style, right? That's a very satisfying thing to be able to say. Whether it's about Mozart or Bach or Beethoven or Brahms or Handel or whoever it is, I once had a professor say, all right, students, for next week I want you to write a piano sonata in the style of Gounod. And we all looked around and said, who the hell is Gounod? Well, he was ribbing us. It was a joke. But the point is that there should be some distinctive feature in any musical stylistic period, and certainly with these iconic performers who had such unique, distinctive voices. And that's what we're going to be trying to latch on to tonight. Is how can we hear this music and say, well, obviously it's jazz, but can we narrow our gaze and say, you know what, not only is it jazz, but I'm willing to make it a true daily double, Alex. And I'm willing to bet that this is jazz from the early 1960s, possibly played by John Coltrane. And I think after tonight's program, I think many of us will feel comfortable being able to make that sort of assessment. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty tonight. We're going to start in 1959, which was, I think it's fair to say, a watershed year for jazz. I'm going to talk about 4 albums, some of which I may have mentioned already. We're going to start in the spring of 1959, where Miles Davis goes into the studio and records Kind of Blue. To date, it is the best-selling jazz record of all time. The opening track on Kind of Blue, which has that famous bass line walk-up, answered by the wind section that's going to be playing as a sort of chorus in a call and response. That figuration, which we're going to hear in just a few moments. That particular recording featured some really iconic musicians on the album. Davis obviously was the alpha. He was the band leader. Miles Davis was a trumpet player. He was also a facile pianist, by the way, and having perfect pitch, he had tremendous skills that come in handy for any musician, but especially for jazz musicians who tend to play quite a bit by ear. There's an old joke, how do you get the jazz musician to shut up and stop playing? And the answer is put some sheet music in front of them. By the way, that joke also works on guitarists. Oh, power chords, pentatonic scales. Here, read this. Oh, no, thank you. Not me. So that's a really cornerstone record featuring Miles Davis, John Coltrane on the tenor saxophone, Cannonball Adderley on the alto saxophone. In the original studio recording, you've got Bill Evans on piano, Paul Chambers on bass. So it's a real sort of condensed nucleus of great jazz minds. Later in the year, you get an album recorded by Coltrane when he deliberately leaves, on his own volition, decides to leave the Miles Davis group. And you might wonder why. Was there some sort of conflict? The answer seems to be yes, there was a conflict. And I think it's fair to say that these kind of conflicts are inexorable when you've got 2 sort of alpha-type figures, both of whom have very particular trajectories in mind for the direction that they want to pursue as artists, as soloists, as arrangers, and so on and so forth. So please come join us. It's okay. We can walk around. Okay. We've got that. Last week we mentioned Dave Brubeck's Time Out album, which features music primarily in odd time signatures. For example, Take 5, which is in the fairly unusual quintuple meter of 5/4. There's the Blue Rondo a la Turque, which we said last week was in some sort of configuration of 9/8, although it's never a consistent 9/8. It could be 2 + 2 + 2 + 3. It could be 3 + 3 + 3. Brubeck is fairly fluid in the piece. And perhaps one of my favorite titles on that album, it's called Unsquared Dance. And it's in 7/4, or what we call septuple meter. One last album, or maybe 2 more albums that I'll mention. Charles Mingus's Mingus which features a piece called Fables of Faubus, which is a biting, scathing criticism of the then governor Orville E. Faubus. And one last one, which is going to be important for next week's program, and to some degree for tonight's, and that is, it's called The Shape of Jazz to Come. You might say it's a record that anticipates the controversial and polarizing style of jazz at the end of the 60s, what we sometimes call free jazz, or what's more broadly known as avant-garde jazz. I know you all love that, right? Well, we're going to listen to some at the end of tonight's program, and it will plant some seeds. Hopefully you're not scared away and you'll come back next week. Besides the honking, shrieking dissonances, there's a lot of beauty buried there. And as with any polarizing musical style, it always helps to have someone just tell you a little bit about what to listen for. And I think that's especially true of avant-garde jazz, as it would be true of the music of Igor Stravinsky or Arnold Schoenberg, or any of the early 20th century atonal what's called the modernists. They lived 100 years ago, but we still call them modernists. So I've had people who, come into a classroom and, they may be gung-ho about Mozart and Beethoven, and they've sworn off atonality, and then at the end of the semester, their favorite opera is Alban Berg's Lulu, which that's a great opera, by the way. Let me just tell you right now, that's beautiful music in there. Let's start with Miles Davis. I shared an anecdote about Davis last week, which gave you a window into this very sort of polarizing personality, this guy who was prone to vulgar, expletive-laden language. This guy who, you might say, had a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Certainly, maybe that's understandable given where he was, how he grew up, and the fact that in the late 1950s, driving around town, zooming up and down the streets of Manhattan in a yellow Lamborghini, tells you that Davis was courting trouble, right? He must have known, he was a smart guy, he must have known on some level that he was instigating. He was trying to poke the proverbial bear, and that bear was society in general. Davis was often contemptuous and disdainful of even his most ardent supporters. It was not uncommon for him to play entire sets at nightclubs with his back to the audience. It was not uncommon for him to accept awards and other accolades without so much as a word of thanks to the group that had conferred that award on him. He's a heel character, you might say, and I don't think Davis would have disputed that. I think that in his autobiography, one of the things that comes across is he's pretty candid about the fact that he had an anger problem for much of his life, and it wasn't really until the 1980s, coming off a 5-year cocaine addiction, where he mellows out a little bit. But even then, if you watch those interviews from the 80s, he's still pretty ornery, and he still has a temper. Part of that might give us an insight into his personality as a band leader, right? In other words, this is someone with really strong convictions. He knows what he wants. And that can be a good thing if you're in the studio and you're telling your musicians what you want from them. But in 1959, Davis did something completely unprecedented. He went into the studio and he gave his musicians almost no indication of what to play, how to play it, when to play it, or what template to follow. And this became a style known as modal jazz. The word modal comes from the word mode. Modes are interesting. If you were to look it up in a music history book or a music theory book, what you would find out is that modes go back to the Renaissance and even the medieval period. And the idea was, before they standardized scales, right? We have these scales when we play music. We have major scales, we have minor scales, and we have other modes, other scale patterns. And each of these has a particular quality. Sometimes we put them on a scale of light to dark, and we say that, the major scales are very bright. But there's something even brighter, known as the Lydian mode. So these modes go back hundreds of years to the Renaissance, at least. We think of the Western system of organizing and composing music really based on a binary system of major and minor, right? And the first questions we ask music theory students when we ask them to analyze a piece is, what key is this in? And the students will say, well, it's in G minor, or it's in B major, whatever it is. Davis's idea going into recording Kind of Blue, and certainly the idea on the tune So What, which we're going to look at in a moment, is that it's not really in a major key or a minor key. It's certainly closer to minor, but it's based on the idea of a contrast between only two fundamental pitches. Now just think about that for a minute. Think about what we talked about last week with bebop. Remember when we talked about this rapid alternation? This sense of changing chords every quarter second, right? And this huge panoply of harmonies, this cornucopia of different, mostly 4-note chords. F major 7, F minor 7, G minor 7, B flat minor 7, E7, E half diminished, A7. Remember that rotating carousel of chords. Davis is going to go maybe to the opposite extreme. He's going to say, hey, we're just going to have two chords here, two notes really. D and E flat. And the idea is this. When you're playing on D, you can choose any white note you want. So those of you who have maybe studied a bit of music theory, or if you've studied Renaissance theory, or if you've taken music theory with me, you might know, and I say that because not every college music theory class goes into modes. You might know that this is what we call the Darien mode. The Darien mode. So it's like a minor scale, but it's got a certain brightness to it. So here's minor, but here's Darien. Same start. Do you hear how it's not quite as sad or lamentative or tragic sounding. There's a certain sweetness to the Darien mode that's mingled with the intensity that we find that's inherent to the minor mode. So for most of the piece, 16 bars to start, Davis says, just play on D. And what that means is that as an improviser, you got your work cut out for you. Because how do you play on one note and make it sound interesting for 16 measures in a row? In a way, bebop, yes, it's fast and it requires certain physical virtuosity, right? That dexterity to negotiate notes on your instrument, whether it's a clarinet or a saxophone or a trumpet or piano or whatever. But what on earth do you do if you've only got one chord for 16 measures? Well, if you were to watch a high school or college jazz band play it, you might notice some students really struggling and sort of just playing the same notes over and over again. Guitarists, by the way, are especially guilty of this. Because guitarists love to get into sort of these pentatonic scales where they a lot of noodling on 5 notes. We're going to watch and see what Miles Davis does, but before we do, let me try to demonstrate how the piece is driven, what the engine is. We said that it's really rooted in D, and above D, you can play any white key you want, and any combination of white keys that you want. And then when it shifts, it's going to shift up exactly 1/2 step to E flat. And in E flat Dorian, you're dealing almost primarily with black keys. So it's almost like, think of it as a color shift. Musical tones are often described as being analogous to visual colors. Let me see if I can demonstrate it. Here's D minor. Here it's the same thing modulated up exactly 1 semitone. Now, that may seem like gobbledygook to some, but let me suggest that everybody in this room would be able to perceive the difference. Here's D minor. And then all of a sudden we get this. Oh, man, that's going to activate the feel spot, right? Because as a listener, you're hearing notes, a 5-note chord, and they don't have any common tones. Every single one of those notes in the second iteration is different. So, versus, some have described it as having a sort of psychedelic sound. That's anachronistic to say that, because psychedelia is not really going to become a big deal until the 1970s. This is 1959. So maybe you could say that it anticipates the sound of later works, later compositions, but composers who are perhaps a bit younger, or maybe their style is evolving in the 70s. But this idea of shifting between D minor, or D Dorian, I'll say, and E flat gives us this pop of color, this sort of shift, which is, I think, very tangible, very perceptible. And what you'll hear in the rhythm section is after they get done playing this head figure, they finish, and the bass is going to walk. we shift. Hear it? And back. So we get a lot of like unconventional, what we call comping patterns. Comping comes short for accompanying. Instead of playing a straightforward chord like we talked about last week, which has a very specific arrangement, right? Or this maybe, or maybe this, or maybe this. Instead of that, you're going to get these harmonies, which they're not very easy to pin down. What exactly is this? I mean, you can find names for them if you really want. You can say, oh, it's a D7 sus4 add 11, or something like that. You know, jazz musicians love to, you know, talk about upper extensions and this note is at 13th above the root, so this is a G13 chord. You know, it's good to know that shorthand. It's good to know that nomenclature, but I guarantee you that most jazz musicians who play this stuff are not thinking, ooh, and now I'm going to go to a G13 chord on this passing eighth note upbeat. It's about feeling, and it's about sound color. It's about giving you that wash of D Dorian and then contrasting it with the E flat Dorian. The form here is a 32-bar form in the AABA format. It's a very common musical form. So you're going to get D, 8 bars each, then E flat for 8 bars, and then finally ending with an 8-bar D minor. So 32 bars, 24 of which are D minor, which means that as a soloist, you really do have your work cut out for you. In some ways, it's very hard to solo in the modal framework because the tendency is just to sound stale. It's just, oh, okay, let me just keep peppering this D or F or whatever other chord tone. And what you'll notice Davis is doing is he's going to go and he's going to hit notes that are outside of D minor. So he's going to do things like, if this is the underlying harmony, he might do something like this. In other words, you'll hear D minor as the foundation, and here's Miles Davis just playing a C major triad. But remember, C major is white keys, so it fits the mode, and it gives you this almost like bitonal quality, like we're in 2 keys at the same time, and it somehow fits. So the thing to take away here is how radically different this is from bebop, not just in tempo, but in its sort of organizational construction. To go from, you know, intricate successions of chords where the harmony changes every half a second to have 24 uninterrupted bars of D minor 7, it's really D Dorian, it's pretty wild. So let's go ahead and listen to Miles Davis's So What. Yeah, technical question. Feel free, fire away. Yeah, well, it is, you know, pretty technically intricate. And yeah, the idea of trying to master the Dorian mode, you know, in a single evening, that's probably a little bit beyond the scope of what we can reasonably expect. The thing to take away is the sort of stasis that's created. That's really what we're looking at here. Modal jazz is very minimalistic in that way. And I think that's something we can hear even if we don't fully, you know, understand that it's C major that's layered upon D minor or whatever it is. We're listening for that sense of stasis and then that modulatory shift, that color sensation pop, like Dorothy when she wakes up in Oz. And we've gone from 0 flats or sharps to almost all flats and sharps. And again, it's a very abstract thing, right, to compare tones to colors, but it's probably the best thing we have for trying to convey the kind of impact, the oral impact that it has on us when we listen. So let's go ahead and hop into the studio with Miles. Okay. We'll pause there. We're going to hear a lot more from John Coltrane tonight. You could tell if you were to compare and contrast the solos from Miles and John Coltrane, you notice that Coltrane's solo is a great deal, this is really technical nomenclature here, ready? It's a great deal busier. It's busy, right? Now, there's two reasons for that. Number one, it's just easier to cover a lot of ground on a saxophone. It's the construction of the instrument, the way that it's hardwired to play, it's easier to flip between notes very quickly. Now, there are some virtuoso trumpet players who can make it look easy, but the trumpet, remember, has 3 valves, and so much of how a trumpet player shapes notes is done with embouchure, and it's not like a saxophone where you just put your fingers on keys and, can flit up and down into different octaves. So that's part of it. I think it's also fair to say that Miles's solo approach, certainly starting in this period, in the 50s, but even before this, is a much more melodic one. Miles was very big on weaving a melodic narrative through his solos. And so you don't get a lot of, the kind of cascading streams of fast, whatever they are, 16th notes or faster, the way you get with Coltrane. Coltrane's style is very hard to imitate. He's someone like, we discussed last week with Charlie Parker. We said those Parker transcriptions are just brutal for aspiring saxophone players to learn. So too with John Coltrane. Miles' transcriptions are much easier. Miles tended not to play in the highest range of the trumpet. He didn't have that, going into the 5th octave the way that someone like, say, Arturo Sandoval is famous for hitting those unbelievably high notes. Miles would typically go up to what was written as trumpet music, an A, a B, high notes, but nothing astronomical, nothing in the stratosphere. And again, his approach was one based more on lyricism, more based on melody. It's hard to say the same thing about Coltrane, right? Coltrane, there was a famous phrase that was coined by a music critic from that period named Ira Gitler. And what Gitler said, he said that Coltrane was creating what he calls sheets of sound. And the idea was, I think, that Coltrane's approach was so fluid and so dynamic that he could make the saxophone almost sound like a polyphonic instrument. Like he could make it sound like it was playing in different registers at the same time and effortlessly bouncing back and creating this sort of wash of sound that articulated whatever the chord changes were supposed to be. Well, Miles was critical of Coltrane. And you almost see Miles smoking a cigarette in the back, and we wonder what he's saying. I wouldn't be surprised if he was criticizing Coltrane for being too busy, for too many notes, to quote the movie Amadeus. Right? There's a scene with the emperor where the emperor says to Mozart, "It was wonderful, Mozart, but just too many notes. Cut out a few and it'll be perfect." And of course, Mozart says, "Which few did you have in mind?" Anyway, the point is that two different approaches, two sort of creative minds who have their own ideas about the direction of jazz and how to lead an ensemble. So it's no surprise that Coltrane leaves the Davis group and forms his own group. And they record a landmark album in late 1959, and it's called, ironically, Giant Steps. Ironically, because it is, in many ways, a giant step for any jazz musician to even attempt to play it. Let me show you what the chord changes look like. Okay. So we have an actual, these are not concert pitch. This is written for a B-flat tenor saxophone, but we'll use them anyway. So we have a C-sharp chord. What the heck? So first of all, seeing anything written with a C-sharp, actual C-sharp major chord, that means you've got a C-sharp, an E-sharp, a G-sharp. What the heck? It's a tough scale to negotiate. It's got 7 sharps in the key of C-sharp. It's an odd scale to C. To go from C-sharp to E to A to C, let's take a look at this strange thing. Okay, so here's C-sharp, okay? The next chord was E, which is over here. Then the next chord after that was A, and after that it was C. And then we go to F and then to B minor. So from C to F to B minor, which is all the way, that would be 2 sharps over here. There's little b, it's B minor. In other words, this symbol, which may mean nothing to most of us here, is a symbol that is almost like looking at a solar system. You know, when you look at a solar system model and it says, okay, the sun is here, and then Mercury, and then there's Venus and Mars, and Mars is beyond Earth, obviously, and then beyond that you've got an asteroid belt, and then you've got Jupiter and Saturn, and so on and so forth, and then beyond it all you've got, you know, the Kuiper belt and the Oort cloud, and all this other stuff that, you know, is just at the, all the way out to the heliopause, which is where the sun's magnetic field has, you know, no impact on the bodies, the celestial bodies out there. And sort of music theory works similarly. We have a sort of gravitational system, and we call it tonality. And it works in jazz too. And the idea is this, that the chords we play, the harmonies that support any musical composition, are typically related. And what that means on this symbol, this chart here, is that they tend to be neighbors, right? So if I'm in key of C, well, it makes very good sense that my next key might be G. Or maybe I go the other way and I go F. But going from C to E would be bizarre because I'm starting in C and I'm going 4 stops clockwise. So I'm sort of juxtaposing 2 chords that have no connection. We can demonstrate this very simply on the piano by playing a cadential formula. If I were to do this, C, F, G, C. And you can see C, F, G, C, right? You can see they're right next to each other. And they both converge on C. They're on opposite sides, and they both want to go back to C, right? And you can hear it. And if I make it a little bit more ornate, everything wants to sort of gravitationally bind itself to the most important, and to use our solar system analogy, to that stellar mass in the center of that solar system. And tonality works the same way. That one tone is always going to sound like it has primacy. It's more important. And you may not even think about it, but it's at work. Most of the time you listen to something, it's working. You like Verdi? Guess what? It's working. You like Mozart, Bach, Handel, Buxtehude? Yeah, that's right, Dietrich Buxtehude. He's our guy, right? We like Buxtehude. Mendelssohn, Brahms. Tonality is working there. It starts to break down with people like Wagner and Debussy, but tonality reigns supreme in much of music history. What Coltrane does here is he gives us chords that have no real functional relationship because they're related by chromatic thirds. In other words, he's jumping all over the circle of fifths. What that means for the performer is you don't just have to have rock solid music theory chops, you've got to have adamantium level music theory chops. You have to know how exactly what the chromatic cross relationships are going to be. And soloing on this piece, even at a slow tempo, would be a challenge for anybody. Coltrane's going to solo on it at 240 beats per minute. And he's just going to be whizzing through these chord changes as if he's playing a 12-bar blues, which is about the easiest chord progression that you could play on. I have yet to see any high school ensemble or even a college jazz band attempt giant steps. And even, me personally, when I have played in different ensembles, I've never heard a drummer or bassist or anyone leading the ensemble say, all right, guys, let's do giant steps next. It's just one of those pieces that's feared in the jazz world by performers. There are very few people who really genuinely like playing on it because it's hard to sound convincing when you're working with this degree of complexity and loosely related harmonies that make it difficult to latch on as a listener. One more analogy, so we used it last week. Think about languages. If C is Spanish, then G is Italian, and F is French, or something like that, right? But if we go from C to E, we're jumping from, Latin to Japanese. And that's kind of how a lot of musicians describe playing on this. But, of course, no problem for St. John Coltrane. The church, by the way, originally declared that he was actually God incarnate. But then they wanted to affiliate with the African Orthodox Church, so they had to demote him to saint. So now it's the Church of St. John Coltrane instead of John Coltrane, God. Okay. question, yeah. No. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, no, let me just clarify because this issue can be somewhat nebulous. The improvisation happens and then somebody with a lot of time on their hands and a really good ear sits down and transcribes a solo. It almost is never the case for a jazz musician to play a solo that's written out. That'd be unusual to do something like that, yeah. He's a lung capacity guy. There are rotary or circular breathers. Most famously, a guy we're going to talk about next week named Rasan Roland Kirk. You've never seen him. Wait till next week. You want to come back and see that for sure. But Coltrane was not a circular breather to my knowledge, no. Yeah, the good question, right? What do musicians who've never seen this before, no musician had ever seen it before, what do they say when they're in the studio and Coltrane hands out the chords and says, all right, guys, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, we know what some of them said. The pianist on the studio recording is Red Garland, right? The famous jazz pianist. And he was very candid about how overwhelmed he felt and how he could barely keep up with the changes. And when asked to solo on it the first time around, he had absolutely no hope. You're just hanging on for dear life. And what great musicians do is they manage, right? They manage. So what do? You have to drop a measure here, you drop a measure there, or you simply play wrong notes. And certainly, we all do that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, how difficult was this accompanist to follow him?
For this piece, we know that the sidemen or the other members of the band found it extraordinarily difficult. You know, other saxophone players younger than Coltrane, for example, Wayne Shorter was, you know, very candid about calling this the boogeyman of jazz charts, that you hang on for dear life because it's so counterintuitive. Jazz musicians, they practice, 2-5-1 progressions, we call them, prescribed chord progressions to articulate a certain sound. And you can't do that here because it's 2-5-1s, but they're in strange keys with no functional relationship. Yeah, Sandy. Somebody who can inhale and exhale at the same time, so they never have to take a breath. Yeah, a famous one, I can't believe I'm about to mention him in this same lecture as John Coltrane, but Kenny G. And the reason I mention him is because he actually is so gimmicky about it that he's done I think he did a Guinness World Record where he stood on a stage and played an E flat for 45 minutes. Yeah, which is more interesting than most of the stuff he plays. So, yeah. Yeah, Coltrane was famously tight-lipped. That's a great question. Did Coltrane ever say, well, here's giant steps, and here's what I'm doing. We're paving the road to the future. No. It was Coltrane was, in many ways, sort of the antithesis of Miles. Miles was brash and loud-mouthed and had a chip on his shoulder. And Coltrane, you might say by today's standards, was very zen. And actually, it's not too far off to say that because Coltrane was fascinated by Eastern philosophy, Hinduism, for example. He was interested in the Upanishads. He was interested in meditation. He named his son after Ravi Shankar, the famous Indian sitarist. So, no, he was more a spiritual, meditative guy, not one who's going to go around saying, well, this is what I'm doing here. And then he has a solo, and you could, even on the studio recording, you could tell his solo is sort of, it's punctuated by these awkward pauses. If we just listen for 30 seconds, you'll hear he's holding on here for dear life. So he clearly, at this point he's had the chart for a while, but you don't get that same level of dexterity that you would hear in Coltrane's solo. He's halting, he's a little bit behind the beat, but it's better than most of us could do. So. Yeah, so when jazz musicians play a chart, they're going to play the same tune many times, but it's never going to be exactly the same. So it's one of the cool things about attending a concert and saying, oh, I was there when Coltrane did that, 20-minute version of My Favorite Things, and I got to hear McCoy play that, 8-minute solo. Hey, that's the next thing we're going to talk about. Yeah. Yeah, there are the record companies, the music critics, and there was a lot of ballyhoo about this piece, and certainly there still is. It remains, again, to use that term, the boogeyman of jazz standards. It is in the real book. You open up the real book, it's there, the same book where you'll find Autumn Leaves and Desafinado and Girl from Ipanema. And then you turn to M and you get, Moment's Notice, and you turn to G and you get Giant Steps. Those are two really tough charts by Coltrane, Moment's Notice and Giant Steps, two really difficult pieces to solo on. Yeah, again, Coltrane, think about this guy who's really into Eastern philosophy and meditation and hypnosis. So it's not so surprising that his solos would stretch on for 10, 15, 20 minutes. This is a guy who had incredible discipline. He would play these gigs, in Harlem, say, and he would leave after a 3-hour show, go home at 2 in the morning and practice his horn till 4 or 5 in the morning. So he was an unusual figure. And of course, he died as a fairly young man. He was 40 years old when he died of liver cancer out in Long Island. So we have one more piece left to talk about, and it's one of my favorite things to discuss. It's a tune recorded in 1961, and it's a famous song, of course, Rodgers and Hammerstein. It's my favorite things. And people think of this song, they think of Julie Andrews, they think of the rolling hills of Austria. Nazis, that too. Yeah. Okay, hey, listen, that's what the movie's about, right? Coltrane takes this tune and he goes into the studio in 1961 and now playing not his usual tenor, but now an instrument more associated with someone he had really idolized growing up, Sidney Bechet. Now he's playing soprano saxophone, so the higher pitched member of the saxophone family. It has a straight bell, so not the distinctive curved bell of a saxophone, and it plays in a higher register. And he's playing on this tune, and the studio recording goes 13 minutes and 41 seconds, I think. And there's basically 2 chords, really just one fundamental root chord. This is modal jazz taken to an extreme degree. And it's based on the idea that you're going to have 2 chords, one based on E, and then moving up to F sharp. And it just sort of rocks back and forth. What we're going to talk about now is actually not John Coltrane. Given a lot of press to the horn players, right? The saxophone players, the trumpet players. They tend to get a lot of the musicological ink, if you will. I want to talk about one of the, I think, most revolutionary pianists of this period, a guy named McCoy Tyner. A few things about Tyner that you're going to hear in just a few moments, which I think are really noteworthy and are such a distinctive part of this 1960s modal jazz voice, this style. First, Tyner's sense of rhythm. My favorite things is really a waltz, the way that Coltrane arranges it. We have this drum rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. You'll see Elvin Jones on the drums here. And what happens when you have 3/4 is that you give your listeners this sort of impulse to move and sway. Triple meter is a very powerful tool, especially in a waltz tempo, which this really is. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The thing is, McCoy Tyner is almost never playing in 3. He's almost exclusively playing in duple meter against it. And that's going to sound like this. Everyone can demonstrate it. If you were to take your right hand and play a 3 pattern, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You can try it. 1, 2, 3. Now let's say I try to fit in exactly 2 notes against 3. So my left hand's going to do 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Yeah, it's like rubbing your head in.
It's like ring Christmas bell.
It's harder than walking and chewing gum. Is that the people use? But it's even harder when you incorporate McCoy Tyner's distinctive brand of harmony, which is based on an idea that flies in the face of traditional harmonic configuration. Usually when we make chords, we make it based on a root, a third, and a fifth, right? Or what we say, do, mi, sol, right? Right? And maybe we add another note to that. But we go up in thirds. Skip a note, skip a note, skip a note. Do it again here. D minor 7, F sharp minor 7, F major 7, G7, E flat major 7. Tyner's going to go in a totally different direction. He's going to stack not thirds, but something that's pretty unusual, and that would be fourths. He's going to stack perfect fourths. Now, some of you are saying, once again, man, I didn't know I was signing up for a music theory lesson tonight. Yes and no. You're going to hear it in a little bit. But remember, because it's only based on one tone, really this is an E piece. This is based on E. Now, it's not E major or minor. It flits around. It dances between them. Because of this root, this almost like drone tone, if you will, that's going to be flavoring the whole piece, it's really important to understand how the harmony is arranged above it. And so the chordal harmony is going to sound like this. Do you hear that? So instead of 1, 3, 5, he's going to do 1, 4, 7. And he's going to loop that all over the place. Now combine that with the polyrhythm we discussed earlier, so that you get this sort of thing. Constantly hitting like that with these left-hand punctuations, occasionally articulating the tonality. I just played that in D. I don't know why I did that. It should be an E. So you'll hear a lot of static tones, a melody, which is not really a melody. It just sort of sits on one note, sort of like this. It's still based on E, but it has sort of sweetness to it, right? E major. Later he's going to go to E minor. Constantly building this rhythmic tension. Occasionally, and in fact the scene we're going to start in the timestamp, if you will, we're going to find McCoy playing in sort of the darkest of the modes, what's called the Phrygian mode. And that's going to have, it's going to be playing around a lot with these sort of dire sounding semitones, and that might sound like this. Constantly plunking these low notes, constantly creating rhythmic tension, constantly fighting between triple meter and this implied duple against it. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You're going to hear that very clearly. You're going to see the left hand, in fact, in the video, always articulating. 1, 2, 1, 2. And meanwhile, the drummer's going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And it's tough. It's tough to play it, certainly. McCoy was famous for this left-hand strike, this left-hand articulation where he could be playing way outside the changes, way outside the time, and then all of a sudden, bam, bring you back with the left hand. His pinky would slam down on that E and remind you where the piece is rooted. So we'll watch a little bit of this video from 1963, and again, we're focusing here not on Coltrane, but rather on McCoy. Okay, so here's Coltrane playing the tune, and we're going to cut out right when he ends and McCoy's solo picks up. So that was about 5 minutes that we watched, and it's very easy to lose track of the time. There is something about this music, this style of jazz, which has been described historically as being very hypnotic, very entrancing. Something about that drone pitch, that E. Did you notice his left hand? No matter what he's playing, every 4 bars, bam, crashing. And again, that raptor-like strike with that accuracy, because he's playing way up into the 4th and 5th octaves even sometimes, and then you just see his left hand snap back, and he never misses. I miss all the time, but he never misses. He hits that E, and it doesn't matter what he's playing before it. He could be playing against the 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and I missed it, of course. But it's this ability to just snap right back. And what it does is, as listeners, is it gives us that foundation. It gives us the tone in the bottom that keeps us grounded. Because he's playing so far outside of E, it still helps us remain sort of centered. And it goes by, and you just hear that constant polyrhythm, the tension between he and Elvin Jones on drums, Jimmy Garrison on bass. And these guys had a synergy which can't be overstated. Eventually, McCoy would leave the Coltrane group because, as we'll see next week, Coltrane went into a new style of avant-garde jazz that not only to McCoy Tyner, but to many musicians didn't make much sense. Let's see a couple questions, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, did Rodgers and Hammerstein say anything about this? Not that I've ever come across. So, you know, it's funny, right? Because it's 13-minute, 41-second recording, but I think probably if you were to add it up, probably, you know, maybe less than 2 minutes of it is actually the tune. The cool thing about this tune, by the way, that I don't know if Rodgers and Hammerstein had this in mind. Their version is in E minor, or is in a minor key. But the tune works in major and in minor. You can play it in, here it is in minor. And you can play it in major. Here's what it would sound like. So I think built into the tune, before it ever gets to Coltrane, there is this sort of modal flexibility built into the tune, because the tune is just outlining, you know, and you'll hear McCoy later in the solo. He's playing with these notes, which is just, except he plays it, you know, he's... Of course, being McCoy, he starts going way outside. Right, and then he's back to it. So the tune has a lot of flexibility built into it, but I don't know that Rodgers and Hammerstein ever commented. Yeah. Yeah, the Renaissance thinkers were obsessed with the Greeks and Romans. So they base a lot of their nomenclature. You know, Petrarch is often credited as like the guy who coins the term the Middle Ages. And it tells us a lot about the Renaissance perspective. The Renaissance thinkers looked back and they saw, the Greeks and Romans were so great. Look at the Romans had marble palaces and aquifers and paved roads and saunas. Who doesn't love a good sauna, right? And then for 1,000 years of European history, you get backwards sort of dogmatic adherence to doctrine and plague and people living in hovels. So for the Renaissance thinkers, they were the ones who coined the mode terms. They look back and they wanted to ignore 1,000 years of history. They didn't care about the cathedrals or anything. It didn't fit the narrative for Petrarch. So they went back and it was the Romans that they really wanted to elevate. And so that's why all of those modes come from, as you pointed out, from antiquity. Yeah. You don't. You have to hear them. That's why if you're playing trumpet or saxophone, you're playing with a rhythm section usually. Whereas if you play piano, you can have a trio, just piano-based drums. But you would never have, I shouldn't say never, it'd be weird to have a trio without a chordal instrument, without either a guitar or a piano, because those are the instruments that give you chords. And that idea, by the way, goes back all the way to the Baroque period with the basso continuo. You should have someone play a bass line, and then someone else should fill in the harmony. So 400 years ago it was a viola da gamba and a harpsichord. Here it's a piano and a upright bass. Yeah. All right, let me tell you a little bit about what's on tap for our next lecture, which is in fact our final lecture in this program series. We've now covered ragtime, we've covered Dixieland, we've covered swing, we've covered bebop, we've covered West Coast jazz and cool jazz. Now we've covered modal jazz. Next week, we're going to look at what comes after modal jazz, and there's a lot of answers to that question. So we will talk about free jazz. We're going to talk about Coltrane, talk about what Miles Davis did at the end of his career. Davis died in 91. Some of his stuff from the 80s is not very good, to be honest, in my opinion. That's an opinion I think that's shared among a lot of jazz fans even of Miles Davis. And Davis didn't care if people didn't like it. Because for him, the important thing was to grow and evolve as a musician and not sort of reinvent the wheel. So we'll look next week at some excerpts from the You're Under Arrest album, some of Miles' stuff from the mid to late 80s, some of which we'll look at a cover of a Michael Jackson song. Miles was very fascinated by rock. I think you might even say obsessed with certain rock musicians, Prince especially, Michael Jackson, Sly and the Family Stone. So there's a lot to talk about with Miles. We're going to talk about some Latin jazz. We're going to talk about some funk, and we're going to talk about Bach. Somehow I'm going to work that in. Yeah. Somehow. 1970, Bitches Brew, yeah. We'll talk about it. The electric phase, electric bass, synthesizer, Herbie Hancock's, Tony Williams, yeah. There's a lot to talk about. So yes, we will talk about all those things and Bach next week. I'll see you guys then.